Hello, welcome to the Maya Toolbelt. This is Michael. So I thought it might be fun to take a look at the effects that Maya comes with. We're in the effects menu set, and then there's the effects menu. And here we have the create category, create an effect, and we have lots of different kinds of effects here. We have smoke, shatter, lightning, fireworks. Then we also have some flow effects here. But I thought we'd look at a basic fire effect. So create fire. So it sounds pretty simple, just create fire. What these essentially are a set of presets, essentially of particle effects that will create the specific effect, like smoke or fire in this case. Now there are other effects in here that don't necessarily deal with particles, such as shatter, which we'll talk about in other videos in the future at some point. But for the fire effect specifically, I thought would be a good starting point. You can see the little icon looks like a sphere that's on fire. So let's look into the options here. So here are the create fire effect options, and there are quite a few of them. You can see there, and if you look at them, if you're familiar with the particle effects of Maya, where you have a particle emitter as well as a particle object itself, you see some very familiar settings in here. I do have a couple of videos going over particle emitters and such, and you can see a lot of these same kind of effects or same kind of settings in the emitter options. I'll just go ahead and take a look at one. Let's go to particles menu, and you can create an emitter like this. Let's look in the options for that. So these are the emitter options when you create one, and you see it has things like speed and let's see, we'll find distance, and you see here there's spread and direction and so on. So let's go back to the fire, go under effects, fire options. So here you see we have speed and direction and spread right here. It's grayed out right now, but also intensity and radius and density and so on. Those are all these kinds of settings can be found within the emitter creation settings. But this is specifically for fire. What they've done is they've kind of truncated the list. They don't have a full list of emitter settings here, just settings that kind of deal with fire specifically. So the first settings up here, we see we have object on fire. You can type in the name of an object if there is one in your scene. Right now my scene's empty, so I need to create something. Let's do like the icon and create a sphere. So create polygon primitives sphere. So that makes a sphere for us here. I'll just scale it up, and I'll go ahead and hide the grid. So I have this sphere here. Now if you select an object before applying the fire effect, you don't have to specify the object on fire here because we already have it selected. But you see it's called P sphere 1 here, so if you did not have it selected and typed in P sphere 1, Maya would know then that you would want the fire applied to this sphere. Then we have the fire particle name, so you can name the fire effect itself. If you leave this blank, Maya will choose a default fire name for your particle effect. And then we get into the actual settings for the fire itself. So let's go to Edit, Reset Settings in our Create Fire Effects Options window to have all the default settings. These are the default values that Maya has specified to create a fire effect. Now you can see they're very specific. We have a fire direction, X, Y, and Z, for example, and so by default the fire effect is set to 0, X, and Z, and 1 in the Y. So that means it's going to be going up in the Y axis. So fire will emit upwards from the sphere, which is, like traditional fire would do. However, you do have the options here to change that direction. If you wanted the fire to be sideways, you could do that by saying 1 in fire direction X and 0 in Y and Z. We're going to go ahead and keep that the default values, but that's essentially what that does. And of course, if you have 1 in X and Y, it would be kind of a diagonal angle between both of those axes. So with all the default values that we have here, let's just go ahead and create the fire as it is and see what it looks like. So with nothing changed, hit create. So nothing really happens right off the bat, but you do see over here on the right I have particle shape 1 selected. You see my sphere is no longer highlighted in green, so my sphere is no longer actually selected. It is selecting the particle that has been applied to the sphere. Now, in order for particles to actually display properly, they need to be played in an animation. So I don't have any of my animation controls visible at the moment. So let's go to Windows, UI Elements. I'm going to break off this. I'm going to turn on the time slider and the range slider. So now I have my animation controls visible. So now my range slider and my time slider. And we're not done quite yet. If we click on this little orange running man down in the bottom right corner, we can go to our time slider settings, and let's make sure our playback speed is to play every frame. The reason why that is because when Maya plays particle effects in the Maya viewer, depending on how powerful your computer is, particle effects can kind of bog down the machine. And so if it's having a hard time playing the frames just due to how much stuff is going on, then the particle effect won't render properly. So if you force it to play every frame, it will slow down the playback speed enough to actually generate each frame, and then the particle effect will play like it should. So that's what we want to make sure we do. Playback speed, play every frame, hit save. Okay, so now that we've done all that, we can actually see what this thing looks like. So I'm on frame 1, I'm just going to hit play, and then hit stop. So you can see the effect that was created. So it doesn't really look like fire. I mean, it does kind of look like fire, but it's gray. For one thing, it doesn't have that fire look to it when it comes to the color. However, if we just hit play again, you can see, it is kind of a fireball effect, or like a burning piece of coal. We can increase the number of frames we have available. Right now we have 120. So let's type in, instead of 120 right here, let's type in 500. Hit enter. Now we have a whole lot more frames, and you can see more of that fire effect. So let's go ahead and render this and see what it looks like. To render it, I'm going to first go to my view menu for my perspective camera, go to camera settings, and I'll break this off. And then I'll choose the resolution gate. So this will tell me what my rendered view looks like. And yours might be different based on what your render settings are currently set at. Then I'll close this. So now I can zoom in and kind of frame this within this area of my screen to know what I'm going to actually look at when I render it. So then up here we have all these little clacker board buttons, or I don't know what you call those those things you see in the movies before they have a take. Like take one, and they hit the clacker, whatever it's called, the film clap thing. That's the technical term. Anyway, there's several of them up here, but we don't want the one with the eyeball. We want to look at this one. We click this one in the middle here that's blank with nothing else on there, and it will render the current frame. So let's go ahead and do that, and then you might have to wait for a few minutes depending on how fast your machine renders. Now mine is just completely black, and that's because by default right now it's choosing the Arnold renderer, which is a new rendering system in Maya 2017 specifically. I don't have any lights in my scene or anything like that yet, so instead of using the Arnold renderer, I'm just going to use Maya software, quote-unquote old default renderer of Maya. And so choose Maya software and then hit that button again. So now we can see the fire effect itself. So this is a still shot. You're not going to be able to see it animated until you render actually an animated sequence of the fire, but you can get an idea what the fire actually looks like by rendering it. So this gives us all that fire look to it with the glow, and it's orange and yellow and everything like that. Okay, so that's essentially, just by clicking the fire button, essentially you've made a fire effect, which can be very handy if you simply need a fire in the background and you're not really specific on what it should look like. This might be a good solution. You can just apply this to, for example, a torch in your distant background, or if you're supposed to see a campfire from a distance or anything like that, you can probably use this effect and kind of forget about it, and because you're not really needing it to look super great. Obviously this is not film quality by any means, and it's not meant to be either. This is like a generic fire effect that Maya provides. So if you're wanting something that looks like super awesome like fire, you're more than likely going to want to do something more custom to what your specific needs are. But let's close this and let's look back at those options. So effects, fire, options. So if you don't need anything else specific with your fire effect, you're essentially done with the video. You chose your sphere, you applied the fire, and you're ready to go. However, if you do want to look more into these options, you can. We have our fire attributes here that we can mess with. Now we've already talked about the fire direction. You can see that this fire is flying upwards because of that fire direction is Y. Let me select the fire, and you can see over here in the far right, this is essentially a particle like any other particle. Again, the create fire option just is essentially a preset of existing particle effects. There are tons of options in here, but you can see here fire direction Y right here, and we can change that right if we type in a number in these three values. If, for example, we said -1 instead of 1, rewind and play, now the fire is going down. So you can change that direction after the fact by changing it over here in the channel box or in the attribute editor. Hit Control A to open the attribute editor, and you can see here we have our emitter and our particle shape, and there's lots of different effects here. Let me actually pull this out so you can maybe see it better. So again, like I said, this is a preset effect, and what it did was it automatically created an emitter, which is what this is. All these little tabs are actually different nodes or objects within Maya that has been created thanks to pushing this create fire button. So again, we have an emitter, we have the particle itself, the particle shape, and then particle object node. We have the particle cloud 2. This is the actual material that looks like fire. You see here the color is that yellowish color with transparency and incandescence, which is the glow. Everything's been mapped with different effects. That's what these, whenever you see the black and white checkerboard button, it has not been affected by anything else, but whenever it has the little box with the arrow, that's telling you that these attributes of this material have all been applied with something in the scene. Then we also have fields. We have a turbulence field, which gives us that turbulent effect. We have a drag field, which I do have videos going over some of these specific effects, these field effects. We have gravity, telling us which direction this is going in, which is, you can tell here, the gravity field is actually being driven by the fire effect, because remember we said fire direction should be -1, and this gravity field has been changed to have a -1 direction. So that fire object is kind of driving all these different things to create these different effects. We have our time node here, we have an array mapper, all sorts of things. They have a ramp for the effect itself. You can see it's got some noise. If you can see this in the video, it's got some turbulence in here. Again, just all these different things and expressions, all just getting this fire effect to be created. Turbulence field here. These are all the expressions that are controlling some of these things. So lots of different nodes have been created when we applied that fire effect to the sphere. Now, if you're making your own custom fire effect, you would need to create these sorts of things more manually in your own time, your own scene. In any case, let's go back to the channel box. So here in the channel box, we have all these different settings that are controlling these different things. So let's go back to our create fire options here and kind of go down the list. So fire density by default is 10. And you can see over here in the channel box, our current fire density is also 10. Scroll down. Here we go. Let's change the direction back to being up. And here is our fire density. So by default it's 10, which this is what we're looking at here. This is a density of 10. So if we change this to, for example, a 2, something much lower, rewind and play, you can see our density is not nearly as thick. It's just changing essentially how many particles are being emitted. If we increase this way high, like 50, now it's like super dense, lots of thick particles in here. We can render this each time we change things. You can kind of see what happens. It might take some time. Here you go. So this is with a much denser particle effect. And I'm actually going to click this little button here. It looks like a mountain with the sun behind it to actually keep this image. We can compare them in the future, otherwise we'll lose them. Alright, so fire density is at 50, and let's go back to 2 again like I did before. Hit play. and then render that. You can see the difference. So this is a density of 2, density of 10. So you can definitely see a big difference there. All right. Then we have our flame start radius and our flame end radius. So if you can see here, if you look at the particle itself, let me zoom in a little bit, you can see that the particle starts out, and because this effect is relatively simple and not very taxing on my machine, I might be able to get away with playing real time instead of play every frame. Because playing it every frame makes it go really fast if it's not really affecting your machine much. So here we go. This is the actual speed of the fire. The play every frame was going too fast. So just as a note, if your particle effect is too taxing on your machine and it's slow and it's not looking right, using play every frame will make it play properly. If it's not taxing on your machine, which these default generic effects probably won't be actually, you can probably just use the real-time playback speed. In any case, back to flame start and end radius. You can see here that these particle effects are starting out relatively large, and as it rises in the air they start to shrink, if you can see that there. Some of them get really small. You can see them kind of pop like little bubbles in here, these little tiny circles compared to these large ones. So what this is doing is the fire starts at a radius of 1 and ends at a radius of 0.4, which is slightly less than half. So if we find that current setting in here, so stop the effect. Here we have fire start radius and end radius. If we change the start radius to, for example, 2, and the end radius to something even smaller, 0.1, we should get a much larger difference. So you can see that huge particle at the beginning, and then they get super small as they shrink and rise up in the air. So that's the start and end radius. Then we have fire intensity. So there was fire density, which we saw before, was how many particles there actually was. I'll take this back to the way it was, 0.1 and 0.4. So fire density was controlling how many particles were being emitted, but then there's fire intensity, which right now is a value of 0.35. So let me rewind and play with the way it is now. This is with a density of 2. Remember, we lowered it from 10. Actually take it back to default 10 just so we can see the difference of what intensity itself does. Let's bring this back. So right now the intensity is 0.35. So let's go ahead and render this current scene the way it is. This should look the same way it did earlier, which is pretty much like this. So I'm going to keep that image. And now I'm going to change the fire intensity value. Instead of 0.35, let's bring it up to 0.75. So we're going to increase the intensity. Rewind, hit play, and then I'll stop it and render it. And we can see what kind of difference we get between the two. So you can see that the intensity, the brightness value has gone up. So this is the way it was before with an intensity of 0.35, and here it is at a 0.75 intensity. So by increasing that intensity, you're increasing that brightness, that glow of the flames. That's controlling the particle shader that has been applied to these that are changing the color and the glow effect of the particle. That's the fire intensity. So fire intensity, let's go back to our settings here. Then we have fire spread, which is grayed out right now. We'll get back to that in a minute. We have fire speed. That's how fast those particles are actually traveling. With a fire speed of 85, they're traveling this fast. As you can imagine, lowering that will, which is right here, lowering that value will change that to be a slower speed. Take it down to 20, for example. You can see they're much slower effect. Then our direction we talked about. Then there's fire turbulence, how shaky it is. Let's actually take this speed value back to 85 like it was before and look at our fire turbulence. Right now it's 240. So rewind, hit play. You can see how turbulent, or how it's moving around. If we take that turbulence way down, let's say down to like 25, something super low. So you can kind of see it, how they're not quite moving around quite as much. Let's go back up to 240, hit enter. So hopefully you can see that it's kind of it's much more subtle than I thought it would be. If we take the turbulence down to something like 0, enter. Okay, so now it's just kind of rising up. They do look like it's still a little bit turbulent. I think it's because of the scaling effect, like because the particles are getting smaller, it looks like there's more turbulence happening than there actually is. But that turbulence effect, let's go back up, is there. You can definitely see it kind of billowing around a little bit more when that turbulence is back up to the default value of 240. And then last in this list is fire scale, which is again the overall size. Let's change that fire scale. Let's find it. Here it is. A value of 1 is the way it is currently. If we take this down, as you can imagine, it should get smaller. Yes, that's 0.25. Much, much smaller. How about we increase it to 2? Twice as large. Much bigger. So it's kind of an overall scale of the entire effect that we have going on. So we saw fire spread here grayed out, and that's because at the very top, this pull down menu, we have the fire emitter type, which is a surface emitter. Now we can change that emitter type to be something else. For example, an omnidirectional point or a directional point. Now when we change it to a directional point, that fire spread value becomes available. But with a surface emitter type, what that means is the fire is actually coming from the surface of the sphere, which makes sense if you're thinking it's on fire. So our fire emitter type, right now we're looking at the particle. So what we need to actually do is look at the emitter. And click this bottom button here. It displays the outliner, which displays everything in our scene. So right now if I select the effect again, if it'll let me, here we go. So when I select this, I'm actually selecting over here the particle 1. And you can see here we have the drag field, the gravity field, and so on. But if we expand the sphere, we see here's the emitter. So if we look at the emitter now and look over here in the channel box, we have the emitter type, which is surface. So here we can change it to be like it was in the options, to be omnidirectional, a curve, or a directional emitter. So if we hit directional, hit play, you don't see much difference because it is actually emitting from the object's points. Like it's hard to explain exactly, but each vertice of the sphere is acting as an emitter when you choose this option. If we choose Omni, let's see if we can see a difference. It's a little hard to tell, I guess. So here's surface. So one thing you can maybe tell better is because you see how the density that we have here with our particles. Let me change the background. So here you can see all those little concentric circles. Those are all of our particles coming from the sphere. Now if I change this to be a directional emitter, rewind, hit play, you can see that density is much, much thicker, right? Now the reason why is because instead of emitting from the surface, but because it's still emitting from the object, when we change it to be a directional emitter, each point on this object becomes an emitter, and every single point is emitting the fire effect, which is of course much, much more particles being emitted because of that. So this is probably not the best example, but in any case, if you think of directional as it's coming from each point, the directional emitter, this actually turns on the spread value, which you see here is 0.15. The spread value is being driven by something else. You see this purple box next to it? So the spread value is actually being controlled by the fire spread setting. So here, if we select the particle effect again, we can find fire spread. Now because we changed the emitter to directional, we should be able to change this fire spread effect, which goes from 0 to 1. So the default value is 0.15, but if we change that spread, let's just try 0 and see what happens. Rewind, hit play. So it's going to be hard to tell, I think, because of our different settings here. Let's try this, see what happens. And I'm going to actually change the fire scale way down to 0.1. Okay, so here hopefully you can see what's going on. As I said, each vertice is emitting the particle effect. I've changed the fire scale super down to 0.1. Maybe that might be too low. 0.5 maybe. No. 0.2. 0.1. 0.2. So each vertex is emitting instead of the entire object now because of that directional emission type. So now our spread value is 0, which means they're not spreading at all. So if we increase this spread value back up to 0.15, which is the default value, you can start to see them spread a little bit better. And this might, again, it's hard to visualize this, I think. But if we increase that spread up to 1, for example, you can see them start to spread more because of the combination of scale and so on. This effect, obviously this is not what you'd want to do for your fire effect. I think the default values for emitting from the surface are probably the more correct ones. You'd have to need something very specific to change it to a directional emitter and so on. So I think in this case, my own personal opinion, if you're going to use a fire effect, probably make it, yeah, emit from the surface, not from directional emitters from each vertex, and then we can avoid all this stuff. But yeah, that's essentially what it means. It does give you those controls. But yeah, that's essentially what's going on. This is what's happening there. So what I'm going to do is just simply go back to the old background and let's look at the render. So yeah, this is what you'd want. This is more like what you'd want the fire to look like. But in any case, they do give you these controls for changing the emitter type, but the default surface emitter type, I believe, would be the best emitter type to use. In any case, thanks for watching. This has been a video going over the Create Fire effect right here under the Effects menu. You have to let me know if you find that useful and something that you might use. Otherwise, if you want something, again, like I said, to look more realistic and also to be more custom, you'd have to do it more manually, I think. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you later.